The lasagna had been sitting in the oven for 2 hours. By the time I finally turned it off, I don't know why I kept it warm that long. My husband had texted me at 6 saying he'd be home by 8. And I'd believed him the way I always believed him. Completely, without question, the way you believe in something so fundamental you don't even think to examine it anymore. 8 became 9. 9 became 10. I sat on the couch with a glass of wine. I wasn't really drinking, watching a home renovation show I wasn't really watching. And I told myself he'd gotten stuck in traffic on the 401. I told myself his phone had died. I told myself 100 small, reasonable things. The call came at 10:47. It was the number for Toronto General, and my first thought, I'm not proud of this, was that something had happened to his mother. She'd had a minor cardiac episode the previous spring, and ever since then, every unknown number made my stomach drop a little. Is this the wife of? And then they said my husband's name, and I said yes, and they told me to come in as soon as possible. They didn't tell me anything else over the phone, but something in the way the woman paused before she spoke, this very specific controlled silence, made me put down my wine glass very carefully, as though the room had become fragile. I drove myself. I don't know why I didn't call someone first. I just got my coat and my keys, and I drove. He was already gone by the time I got there. A massive heart attack, the doctor told me. Very sudden. There was likely nothing anyone could have done, even if they'd been right there with him. And then she said, "Were you aware that your husband was brought in by a companion?" She was the one who called 911. I asked her to repeat that. A companion. The doctor looked at me with this expression I will never forget for the rest of my life. Not pity exactly. More like a kind of careful practiced neutrality that told me she had delivered news like this before. The layered kind. The kind that hits you in waves. She handed me a form to sign and gave me a moment, and I sat in that plastic chair. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that my husband had not been stuck in traffic. What I didn't expect was what happened when I walked into the family waiting room. My mother-in-law was already there, so was my brother-in-law, and my sister-in-law, and my sister-in-law's husband, all 4 of them, sitting in a row like they'd been there for hours. My mother-in-law's eyes were red. My brother-in-law was on his phone. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at them and I thought, how? My mother-in-law lived in Mississauga. My brother-in-law was in Oakville. My sister-in-law and her husband had driven from Hamilton. I had lived 12 minutes from this hospital and I had still barely made it in time. How had they all gotten here before me? The answer came 3 days later, buried in my husband's phone history, which I had every legal right to access because the phone was on our shared plan. He had called his mother at 9:15 that evening. While he was still with her. His mother had known where he was. His mother had known about her. But that night, in that waiting room, I didn't know any of that yet. My mother-in-law stood up and held out her arms, and I walked into them because what else do you do? She was crying. I think I was crying. No? My brother-in-law put his hand on my shoulder and said something about how these things happen without warning. And I nodded, and my body was doing all the right things while some other part of me floated somewhere near the ceiling and watched. Then my sister-in-law said, "We need to start thinking about the arrangements." I looked at her. "The funeral home," she said. "We should call tomorrow morning first thing. The good ones book up fast." My mother-in-law squeezed my hand. He would have wanted something dignified, something that reflects who he was. Who he was. I kept turning that phrase over in my head. "We were thinking," my brother-in-law said, and I noticed he'd put his phone away, which meant this was a planned speech, that given the circumstances, the costs should come out of the joint account. Or your Visa Infinite. The one with the high limit, I said. Excuse me? You have that card, my sister-in-law said as if I needed clarification. The TD one. He mentioned it. My husband had apparently discussed my personal credit card with his entire family. The card that was in my name, the card I had applied for, on my own income. Before we were even married, because I traveled frequently for work and needed the travel insurance benefits. My husband was on the account as a secondary holder, but the primary account, the credit history, the limit, the liability, was mine. It's what he would have wanted, my mother-in-law said quietly. For us not to struggle, you wouldn't want us to struggle. There it was, wrapped in grief, but there it was. I told them I needed some air. I walked down the hallway and found a family consultation room that was empty, and I sat in there alone for about 15 minutes. And I did something I had never done before, in 11 years of marriage. I started adding things up. My mother-in-law's rent. My husband had been sending her $400 a month since his father passed, which I had agreed to. Early in our marriage, when money was tighter, and it felt like the right thing to do, and which had somehow never been revisited even as our incomes grew. My brother-in-law had been between opportunities, his phrase, for going on 2 years, and my husband had been covering his phone bill, his car insurance, and the occasional grocery run that turned into $600 at Costco. My sister-in-law's husband had a gambling problem that was apparently an open secret in the family, and there had been a loan. My husband had called it a loan of $15,000 about 18 months ago, and I had not seen a single payment. In 11 years of marriage, I had never once received a direct thank you from any of them for any of it. I went back to talk about the arrangements in the morning and that everyone should go home and rest. My mother-in-law hugged me again. My sister-in-law said they'd come by the house at 9. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for a long time. The lasagna was still in the oven, stone cold by now, and when I finally went inside and saw it sitting there, I started crying in a way I hadn't been able to cry at the hospital. Not just for my husband, but for the specific miserable humiliation of it. The lasagna, the wine glass, the home renovation show, the complete and total ordinary Tuesday I had believed I was having. My best friend came over. She had texted me 40 times and I hadn't answered any of them, and eventually, she just drove to my house. Juice and let herself in with the spare key she'd had since university. She sat with me in the kitchen and she listened to everything, and she said very quietly, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet, but I was starting to think about it. The next morning, at 9 on the dot, my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law arrived. My brother-in-law came 20 minutes late, which was consistent with his general approach to everything in life. They had brought a notepad, and my sister-in-law had clearly done some research because she had printed out pricing from 2 different funeral homes in Etobicoke. The numbers were significant. They were talking about a full visitation, a church service, a reception afterward at a rented hall, a burial plot at a cemetery in Brampton near where my mother-in-law lived. The total, across her 2 printed pages, came to somewhere between $20,000 and $28,000. My mother-in-law looked at me across the kitchen table. "You'll take care of this," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. My brother-in-law cleared his throat. "And in the short term, just until things settle, we'll need somewhere to stay. A hotel for a week or 2 gets expensive. You have the guest room," my sister-in-law said, "and the basement is finished." I looked around my kitchen, the kitchen I had renovated, the house that was in my name alone. Because when we'd bought it 6 years ago, my husband's credit score had been in rough shape from some financial decisions he'd made in his 20s, and our mortgage broker had advised that I apply as the sole purchaser. Which I had done, which meant that every payment for 6 years had come out of my income. Which also meant that the house, legally, unambiguously, belonged to me. I need a few days, I said. My mother-in-law reached across the table and patted my hand. Of course, take until tomorrow. After they left, I called my best friend. Then I called a lawyer. A friend of hers who specialized in estate law and did a free initial consultation over the phone. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. My husband had no will. In Ontario, when there's no will, the estate goes through intestate succession. Given that we had no children, I would inherit his estate, but his estate consisted primarily of a car that was 3 years from being paid off and a savings account with about $4,000 in it, and I was only now fully mapping the dimensions of this. The money he earned had been quietly redistributed to everyone around him for years. I also asked the lawyer about the credit card. She was very clear. A debt in my name was my debt, regardless of what anyone else expected. If I chose to pay for funeral expenses, that was my choice. If I chose not to, no one could compel me. I sat with that for a long time. I need to tell you something about who I was before all of this, because I think it matters. I was the person who filled out the forms. I was the person who made sure the car insurance renewed on time, and the property taxes were paid in the right quarter, and the smoke detector batteries got changed every October. I organized the family Christmas gathering 4 years running. Because no one else would, I remembered everyone's birthdays, including my brother-in-law's, including his girlfriend's, including her mother's, because, at some point, I had added them all to my calendar app and never removed them. I was not a pushover. I had a demanding job. I had my own opinions. I could hold my own in an argument. But I had been raised to believe that keeping the peace was a form of love, and I had treated that belief like a religion for 11 years. The woman who had called 911 from a hotel room on King Street West had apparently known my husband for 14 months. I found this out not from anyone in his family. None of them ever mentioned her. Not once, not a single syllable. But from a mutual colleague of his, who reached out to offer condolences and made the mistake, or perhaps the kindness, of assuming I already knew the whole story. 14 months, he had met her at a conference in Vancouver. She worked in the same industry, a few rungs below him. She was 26. I was 31. The morning of the third day, I called the bank. My husband and I had a joint checking account for household expenses, but I also had my own personal accounts that he had never been added to. I separated what I needed to separate. Then, I called the TD line on the back of my Visa Infinite, and I told them I wanted to remove the secondary cardholder. The representative asked if I wanted to do that immediately or at the end of the billing cycle. Immediately, I said. Today. Then I sat down with my laptop and I pulled up the mortgage portal and I looked at my equity and I thought about what my life was going to look like. If I stayed in this house that was 5 minutes from my mother-in-law, 15 minutes from my brother-in-law, 20 minutes from my sister-in-law, and all of them knowing that I had 4 bedrooms and a finished basement and a line of credit they'd decided was theirs to access. I called a realtor that afternoon, she was someone I knew peripherally from a neighborhood association meeting, and I trusted her immediately, because she listened more than she talked. I told her I wanted to list quickly. She came by the next morning and walked through the house and gave me a number. and the number was higher than I expected because the market in our neighborhood had moved significantly over the past 2 years. She said, if we priced it right, we'd have offers within a week. I said, let's do it. My mother-in-law called that evening. She wanted to know what I'd decided about the funeral arrangements. I told her I had decided not to use the credit card for the costs. There was a silence. Then how? She said. I've contacted a funeral home directly, I said, which was true. I had arranged something modest. A cremation, a small private service, a reception at my house for immediate family only. The cost was manageable, and I could cover it from my own savings without taking on debt. The arrangements are made, I'll send you the details. That's not what we discussed, she said. I know, I said. But it's what I've decided. My sister-in-law called 20 minutes later. Her tone was different, less sad, more practical, which in some ways I found easier to deal with. She said the family had been counting on a certain kind of farewell for her brother. She said that the size and manner of a funeral reflected on the whole family. She said that as his wife, this was my responsibility. I understand you feel that way, I said. You have the means, she said. Having the means doesn't obligate me to spend them in a particular way, I said. I'm sorry, the arrangements are made. She hung up. My brother-in-law texted me at 11 that night. The text was long and it was not kind. It covered in some detail everything the family had believed my husband contributed to our household. Everything they felt I owed them in return for his years of dedication. And it ended with a suggestion that I was being deliberately cruel at the worst possible time. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the bedside table and I went to sleep. Which was the first time in 4 days I'd managed more than 2 hours. The service was small, 11 people. My best friend stood next to me the entire time and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. My mother-in-law cried, and I put my arm around her, because whatever else was true, she had lost her son. My brother-in-law stood slightly apart from everyone and stared at the floor. My sister-in-law did not look at me once. Afterward, when the last car had pulled out of my driveway, I stood in my living room and I looked at the furniture and the bookshelves and the framed photos and the rug I'd spent 3 weeks choosing, and I thought, I could stay here. I could absorb all of this and stay and give them what they want, and make myself smaller and smaller until I fit into whatever version of me was easiest for everyone. Or I could not. The house sold in 6 days. We had 4 offers and I accepted the second one, because the people were a young couple and they had a baby. And I don't know. Something about that felt right. The closing date was 60 days out, which gave me time. I had started looking at rentals in Calgary about a week after listing. A friend from university had moved there 3 years ago and had been gently suggesting for years that I should consider it. I had always said Toronto was home. But Toronto was also my mother-in-law's rent and my brother-in-law's car insurance and a 14-month hotel room on King Street West. Calgary was just a city I didn't know yet, which at that particular moment sounded like the closest thing to freedom I could imagine. I found a 1-bedroom apartment near the river and signed a year lease. I gave notice at my job in Toronto and within 3 weeks had a position at a company in Calgary, doing essentially the same work for slightly more money. I didn't tell my in-laws I was leaving until 10 days before I moved. I sent an email. Not a text, an email. Because I wanted to be able to write it carefully and have a record of it. Explaining that I had sold the house and was relocating. And that the monthly transfers to my mother-in-law's account would end at the close of the estate, which they did. My mother-in-law called me 4 times that day. I let them go to voicemail. My sister-in-law sent me a message calling me heartless. She said I had no compassion. She said the family had suffered enough without me abandoning them. I read it once and then I moved it to a folder labeled Archive, and I went back to packing my books. The woman, the one from the hotel room, found me through LinkedIn about 6 weeks after my husband died. Her message was long, and I could tell she had rewritten it multiple times. She said she was grieving too, she said. She and my husband had had something real. She said she thought I should know that he had talked about wanting to leave, about building a different kind of life, and that she felt she had a right to some recognition of her loss. I read the message while I was sitting on the floor of my nearly empty living room, surrounded by boxes. I thought about the lasagna. I thought about the 401, and his phone, dying, and the 100 small reasonable things. I did not respond. I blocked her, and then I went back to packing. My last night in that house, I ordered sushi. Not lasagna. I was done with lasagna for a while, and I ate it sitting on the kitchen floor because the table had already gone with the movers. My best friend video called me from her apartment across the city, and we ate dinner together over FaceTime, and she made me laugh 3 times, which felt like an achievement. In the morning, I handed the keys to my realtor, who handed them to the lawyers, who would hand them to the young couple with the baby. I drove to the airport with 1 suitcase and 2 carry-ons, and a completely undecided feeling about whether I was doing the right thing or simply running away. My therapist, who I had started seeing in week 2 of all this, told me those 2 things were not mutually exclusive. She said sometimes you run towards something by running away from something else. She said the important thing was knowing what you were leaving behind. I knew exactly what I was leaving behind. Calgary in October is colder than I expected, and the sky is bigger than any sky I've seen in my life. My apartment has a window that faces west. And in the evenings, when the light drops behind the mountains, it turns a color I don't have a word for yet. Not quite orange, not quite pink, something that looks almost like the beginning of something. I open that window sometimes when I'm cooking dinner. The air is cold and clean and completely indifferent to anything that happened to me in Toronto. And I stand there breathing it in, and I feel not happy exactly. Not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that has room to grow. That's enough for now. That's more than enough.